The day I became the most feared homeowner on Oak Ridge Lane wasn't when I moved in, or when I renovated my garage into a workshop, or even when I started winning awards for my electronic inventions. It was the day Patricia Holloway's BMW lost 4 tires simultaneously in my driveway. If you're watching this video because someone keeps parking in your space, stick around. I'm about to show you how a mild-mannered electrical engineer with too much time and just enough spite can solve a parking problem permanently. My name is Daniel. Until about 7 months ago, I was living what most would consider a perfectly ordinary suburban life. I'd spent 12 years working my way up to senior electrical engineer at a tech firm, had a modest but comfortable home in a quiet neighborhood, and generally kept to myself. My colleagues knew me as the calm, rational problem solver who could troubleshoot any circuit issue without raising his voice. My neighbors knew me as the quiet Asian guy who maintained an immaculate lawn and occasionally brought over homemade kombucha. What no one knew, at least not yet, was that 20 years of working with complex electronic systems had given me skills that extended far beyond corporate applications. Skills that would prove surprisingly useful when Patricia Holloway moved into the house across the street. Patricia, never Patty as she quickly informed everyone, arrived in our neighborhood with the subtlety of a military invasion. The moving trucks blocked traffic for an entire Saturday as an army of workers transferred her expensive furniture into the colonial-style house that had previously belonged to a retired librarian. Watching from my living room window, I observed Patricia directing the movers with imperious gestures, frequently checking her diamond-encrusted watch and speaking sharply into her phone. Our first actual interaction occurred 3 days after she moved in, when she appeared on my doorstep with a gift basket containing a bottle of mid-range wine and store-bought cookies. "I'm Patricia Holloway," she announced as I opened the door. "I've just purchased the Andersons' old home." She gestured vaguely behind her toward the house across the street. "Welcome to the neighborhood," I replied with a polite smile. "I'm Daniel. I've lived here about 5 years now." Her eyes briefly scanned my modest home, lingering on the slightly worn welcome mat and the practical Honda in my driveway. Something in her expression shifted subtly, like she was mentally categorizing me and finding the result unimpressive. "Yes, well, I wanted to introduce myself to all the immediate neighbors. I'm hosting a small housewarming gathering this Saturday evening. Nothing fancy, just cocktails and canapes. You're welcome to attend if you'd like." She handed me an embossed invitation card that somehow managed to feel both heavy and insubstantial at the same time. "Thank you," I said, genuinely appreciative of the gesture despite her somewhat cool demeanor. "That's very neighborly of you." Patricia offered a thin smile. "I believe in establishing good relationships with one's neighbors. It makes everything run more smoothly." With a nod that felt like dismissal, she turned and headed toward the next house on her introductory tour. I attended her gathering that Saturday, bringing a bottle of sake from a local distillery I particularly enjoyed. The party was hardly the small gathering she'd described. At least 40 people filled her extensively redecorated home, many of whom appeared to be business associates rather than neighbors. Patricia had hired caterers, a bartender, and even a string quartet that played softly in the corner of her living room. When I offered her the sack, she accepted it with a distracted "how thoughtful" before immediately handing it to a server who whisked it away to some unseen location where, I suspected, it would remain unopened. Throughout the evening, I observed Patricia working the room like a politician, spending more time with guests who arrived in luxury vehicles and designer clothes, while giving merely perfunctory attention to the neighbors in more modest attire. I left after an hour, having exchanged pleasant conversation with several other neighbors, but barely speaking to our hostess after the initial greeting. The whole experience left me with a vague unease about Patricia Holloway, but nothing concrete enough to justify any real concern. She seemed status-conscious and perhaps a bit cold, but that hardly made her unique or threatening. I resolved to maintain polite neighborly relations while keeping a respectful distance. That resolution lasted exactly 11 days. I returned home from work one rainy Tuesday evening to find a gleaming white BMW parked in my driveway. not partially blocking it, not overlapping slightly, fully parked in my private driveway as if it belonged there. I double-checked to make sure I hadn't somehow pulled up to the wrong house, but no. This was definitely my modest blue ranch-style home with my house number clearly displayed, and that was definitely a stranger's luxury vehicle occupying the space where my Honda should be. Confused and increasingly irritated as rain soaked through my jacket, I parked on the street and approached my front door. There, I found a note taped to the door in elegant handwriting. Needed a place to park while visiting a friend. Your driveway was convenient. Back in 2 hours. P.H. I stared at the note in disbelief. Not only had she helped herself to my private property without permission, but she hadn't even bothered to ask or apologize. Just a breezy notification, as if she were doing me a favor by informing me at all. I called the non-emergency police line and explained the situation. The dispatcher informed me that since this was private property, I had every right to have the vehicle towed at the owner's expense. She provided contact information for a local towing company, which I called immediately. 40 minutes later, just as the tow truck was backing into position, Patricia came hurrying up my driveway, designer umbrella in hand and outrage on her face. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, addressing both me and the tow truck operator. "Removing an unauthorized vehicle from my private property," I replied calmly. "As the note you left suggested you'd be gone for 2 hours, I couldn't exactly wait for your return to access my own home properly." "I was just at Marie's house across the street," she said, gesturing toward a home 3 doors down. "You could have come and gotten me instead of calling a tow truck. This is completely unreasonable." The tow truck operator, a heavy-set man named Dave, according to his name patch, looked between us uncomfortably. "Mom, once we've been called and dispatched, there's a service fee, even if we don't complete the tow." Patricia's eyes narrowed. "Fine. How much?" $75, ma'am." Without hesitation, she opened her purse, extracted a crisp $100 bill, and thrust it at him. "Keep the change. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to move my car." Dave accepted the cash with a bemused expression, nodded to me with a shrug that spoke volumes about the unusual situation, and returned to his truck while Patricia backed her BMW out of my driveway. I thought that would be the end of it. Surely, having nearly had her car towed and being forced to pay a service fee would deter her from using my driveway again. Once more, I was wrong. 3 days later, I returned from a grocery run to find the same white BMW in my driveway. This time, there wasn't even a note. I immediately called the same towing company, and this time I specifically requested Dave, who had given me his direct line just in case. "She's back, huh?" he said when I explained the situation. "Some people never learn. I'll be there in 20 minutes. True to his word, Dave arrived promptly and began setting up to tow the BMW. Once again, just as he was ready to lift the vehicle, Patricia appeared, as if she had some sixth sense for when her car was in danger. "Again?" she exclaimed, looking more annoyed than concerned. "Really, Daniel, this is getting ridiculous." "I agree completely," I replied. "It is ridiculous that you continue to park in my private driveway without permission after nearly having your car towed once already." "The street parking was full," she said dismissively. "And you weren't home. I don't see why you're making such a fuss about an empty driveway going unused." "Because it's my property," I explained, struggling to maintain my calm demeanor. "Whether I'm using it at any given moment is irrelevant. You wouldn't walk into my backyard and set up a picnic just because I wasn't out there, would you?" Patricia waved her hand as if swatting away an annoying insect. "That's hardly the same thing. In any case, I'll move it now." She turned to Dave. "I suppose you'll want another service fee." "Yes, ma'am. Same as before." She paid him, moved her car, and left without another word to me. As Dave was preparing to leave, he gave me a sympathetic look. "Some free advice? Get yourself some security cameras and maybe those fold-down driveway posts. Lady like that doesn't seem like the type to take no for an answer." I thanked him for the suggestion and spent that evening researching driveway security options online. The fold-down posts seemed practical, but required concrete work I wasn't prepared to undertake immediately. Most commercial solutions felt either too permanent or too easily circumvented by someone as determined as Patricia seemed to be. Over the next 2 weeks, the pattern continued with increasing frequency. I would return home from work or errands to find Patricia's BMW in my driveway. I would call Dave, who would arrive to tow it. Patricia would appear just in time, pay the service fee with obvious irritation, but no actual remorse, and move her car. Once, I came home to find her car there and went directly to her house to ask her to move it, only to be told by her housekeeper that Miss Holloway was unavailable, but would move her car when convenient. After the 6th incident in less than a month, I decided enough was enough. If conventional deterrence wouldn't work, perhaps it was time for a more creative solution. I'm an electrical engineer by profession, but my passion has always been tinkering with electronics in my home workshop. Over the years, I've created everything from custom smart home systems to remote-controlled lawn maintenance equipment. My specialty is creating practical solutions to everyday problems, and Patricia Holloway had definitely become an everyday problem. The concept came to me while watching a police drama where officers used a spike strip to stop a fleeing vehicle. Obviously, I wasn't looking to create anything that would cause a high-speed blowout or risk actual physical harm. But what if I could design something that would cause just enough inconvenience to make my driveway an unappealing parking option? I spent the next 2 weekends designing and building what I privately called the Dissuader, a remote-controlled, retractable device that could be embedded flush with my driveway near the entrance. When activated, it would extend small, blunt prongs, not sharp enough to immediately puncture tires, but with enough pressure to slowly deflate them over the course of about 30 minutes through the valve stems. The device could be completely hidden when retracted and was designed to withstand being driven over when in its passive state. Installing it required some concrete work after all, which I performed late one night when the neighborhood was quiet. I positioned it perfectly so that any car pulling into my driveway would naturally place at least 2 tires directly over the device. I then carefully resurfaced the area to match the rest of the driveway, leaving no visible evidence of the installation. The control system was elegant in its simplicity, a secure app on my phone that would activate the device remotely, along with a timer function that would automatically retract the prongs after a set period to prevent any unintended consequences. I also installed a small discrete camera that would send an alert to my phone whenever a vehicle entered my driveway, allowing me to decide whether to activate the Dissuader. I tested the system thoroughly with an old tire, confirming that the prongs would cause a slow, controlled deflation rather than a sudden blowout. Safety was my primary concern. I wanted to create an inconvenience, not a hazard. With the system installed and tested, I waited. I didn't have to wait long. The very next day, while at work, I received an alert on my phone showing Patricia's white BMW pulling into my driveway. The timestamp was 11:42 a.m. Presumably, she was attending another midday social event in the neighborhood. I monitored the live feed for a few minutes, confirming that she had indeed left her car and walked away. My finger hovered over the activation button on my phone. This was the moment of truth, the point where a reasonable person might reconsider and take the high road. But after weeks of Patricia's entitlement and dismissal of my property rights, after multiple towing calls and confrontations that had resolved nothing, my patience had run out. I pressed the button. On my screen, I watched as the device performed exactly as designed, small prongs extending silently from the driveway surface, directly under the front tires of Patricia's BMW. The camera wasn't high resolution enough to show the actual deflation, but I knew from my tests that air would now be slowly escaping from both front tires. I went back to my work, occasionally checking the camera feed. At 1:37 p.m., almost 2 hours later, Patricia returned to her car. From the camera angle, I couldn't see her expression when she discovered 2 flat tires, but I could see her body language shift from casual confidence to rigid surprise. She circled the car, examining each tire, then pulled out her phone. A roadside assistance call, presumably. I felt a momentary twinge of guilt, which quickly dissipated when I remembered how many times I'd been forced to park on the street and walk through rain or snow because this woman felt entitled to my private property. The real beauty of the dissuader was that there would be no evidence of tampering. The prongs had retracted automatically after 45 minutes, leaving no visible cause for the deflation. Tire valves can leak for many reasons, and simultaneous flats, while unlikely, aren't impossible. It would seem like simple bad luck rather than deliberate action. I left work a bit early that day, curious to see the aftermath. When I arrived home, Patricia's BMW was still in my driveway, now with a roadside assistance truck parked behind it. The technician was in the process of inflating the tires, while Patricia stood nearby, arms crossed, an expression thunderous. I pulled up to the curb and approached casually. "Car trouble?" I asked, as if this weren't the outcome of my own handiwork. Patricia turned to me, eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Someone tampered with my tires while I was at lunch with Marie." I raised my eyebrows in an expression of innocent surprise. "That's unfortunate, though I'm not sure why anyone would target your car specifically in a private driveway." I put slight emphasis on the words private driveway, which wasn't lost on Patricia. "If you think I don't know exactly what happened here," she began, but was interrupted by the service technician. "Ma'am, there's no sign of tampering I can see. The valve stems are intact, no punctures in the tire walls. Sometimes these European models have valve issues in certain weather conditions. I've re-inflated them, but you might want to have your dealer check them out to make sure it doesn't happen again." Patricia looked unconvinced, but thanked the technician and paid his service fee. As he drove away, she turned back to me. "This isn't over, Daniel," she said quietly. "I know this wasn't a coincidence." I maintained my expression of mild concern. "I'm just glad it wasn't a bigger problem with your car. Those BMWs can be expensive to repair. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to park in my own driveway." With visible reluctance, she got into her car and carefully backed out, the newly inflated tires appearing none the worse for their temporary deflation. I pulled my Honda into its rightful place, nodding politely to Patricia as she drove away. I expected some form of retaliation, perhaps a complaint to the Homeowners Association, which our neighborhood didn't actually have, or even a police report about suspected vandalism. But days passed with no official repercussions. Patricia did, however, begin giving me the coldest of cold shoulders whenever our paths crossed, which was an improvement over our previous interactions. More importantly, she stopped parking in my driveway for about 2 weeks. Just when I thought the problem was solved, I received another alert while at work. The camera showed Patricia's BMW once again occupying my driveway. This time, however, it was positioned differently, parked at an angle that left the tires carefully avoiding the specific area where the dissuader was installed. This was unexpected. Had she somehow spotted the installation despite my careful work? Or was this simply paranoid caution after her previous experience? Either way, it was clear that my current setup wasn't going to be effective unless I could expand it to cover more of the driveway, an undertaking that would require significantly more concrete work and expense. I needed a different approach. That evening, I modified my system. Rather than relying solely on the embedded device, I created what appeared to be an ordinary garden hose crossing my driveway, except this hose contained a secondary deployment system for the dissuader, allowing it to be positioned anywhere needed. To the casual observer, it would look like I'd simply left a hose across the driveway while watering plants. The next time Patricia parked in my driveway, just 3 days later, I was ready. The camera alert showed her BMW carefully avoiding the original installation area, but rolling directly over my garden hose. Perfect positioning. This time, I waited until the 2-hour mark of her visit before activating the system. I figured this would maximize the inconvenience factor. She'd return to her car, just as the tires were becoming noticeably flat rather than coming back to already flat tires that could be addressed immediately. The plan worked even better than I'd hoped. My camera captured Patricia returning to her car, starting it, and then stopping almost immediately when she presumably felt the unusual handling of nearly flat tires. She exited the vehicle, inspected the tires with increasingly agitated movements, and then made another phone call. This time, when I arrived home, I found Patricia sitting in her car with all 4 windows up despite the pleasant weather. The roadside assistance truck arrived shortly after me, and I watched from my front porch as the same technician from before inspected the now familiar BMW. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I could see Patricia gesturing emphatically toward my house and the technician shaking his head. After he finished inflating the tires, Patricia paid him and then marched directly to my front door. I opened it before she could knock. "Good afternoon, Patricia. More car trouble." "You did this," she stated flatly. "I don't know how, but this is your doing." I maintained a neutral expression. "That's quite an accusation. What exactly are you suggesting I did?" "My tires were perfectly fine when I parked here. Now they're flat. Again, in your driveway. Again. Which raises the question of why you continue to park in my driveway without permission, especially after experiencing car trouble here previously," I pointed out. "Most people would consider that a sign to park elsewhere." Her eyes narrowed. "The service guy says there's no evidence of tampering. No nails, no punctures, nothing. It's like the air just decided to leave my tires. Twice. Only in your driveway." I shrugged. "That is strange. Perhaps your BMW has developed an unusual mechanical issue. Or perhaps it's simply bad luck. Or ... I paused, allowing a small smile. "Perhaps your car is trying to tell you something about where it should and shouldn't be parked." Patricia's face flushed with anger. "You think you're clever, don't you? I've filed a police report this time. They may not be able to prove anything yet, but they're aware of the situation." "As they should be," I agreed calmly. Repeatedly parking on private property without permission is indeed a matter for police attention. She stared at me for a long moment, apparently trying to decide if further confrontation would be productive. Eventually, she turned on her heel and walked back to her car. "This isn't over," she called over her shoulder as she carefully drove away. I suspected she was right about that, but I'd prepared for escalation. That evening, I checked my security cameras and doorbell footage to confirm that no police officers had visited while I was still at work. Then, I temporarily removed all traces of the dissuader from my driveway, storing the components in my garage workshop. If Patricia had indeed filed a police report, I wanted to ensure there would be nothing to find if they decided to investigate. The next day, Officer Rivera from the local police department did stop by. He was polite but direct. "We received a report from your neighbor, Ms. Holloway, alleging that you may have tampered with her vehicle while it was parked in your driveway." "I see," I replied, inviting him in. "Though I'm curious why Ms. Holloway's car was in my private driveway to begin with, given that she doesn't have permission to park here." Officer Rivera nodded. "She mentioned it was a parking arrangement between neighbors. Is that not the case?" I couldn't help but laugh. "Officer, there is no arrangement. Ms. Holloway has repeatedly parked in my driveway without permission over the past several weeks. I've had to call towing services multiple times, which she's avoided only by appearing at the last minute and moving her vehicle. I have records of these calls if you'd like to verify." The officer's expression shifted slightly. "I see. And regarding her vehicle issues?" "I know nothing about those beyond what she's told me. Both times I was at work when she claims the problems occurred. My understanding is that the service technician found no evidence of tampering, just flat tires." Officer Rivera made some notes. "Would you be willing to let me take a look at your driveway, just as a routine part of investigating her complaint?" "Of course," I agreed readily, knowing there was nothing to find. "Please, feel free." He spent about 10 minutes examining my completely ordinary-looking driveway, finding nothing suspicious. Before leaving, he gave me a knowing look. "Just between us, we get neighbor disputes like this all the time. Without evidence, there's nothing to investigate. But if you have any security footage of Ms. Holloway parking here without permission, that might be useful if this situation escalates further. I thanked him for the suggestion and assured him I'd look into better security measures. Once he left, I felt reasonably confident that Patricia's attempt to involve the authorities had backfired by revealing her unauthorized use of my property. For nearly 3 weeks afterward, my driveway remained blissfully Patricia-free. I kept the dissuader components stored away, wondering if the police visit had finally resolved the situation. Perhaps having her parking arrangement lie exposed had been embarrassing enough to deter her. Then came the Saturday morning when I glanced out my front window to see Patricia speaking with Marie and another neighbor, gesturing repeatedly toward my house and driveway. Though I couldn't hear their conversation, her body language suggested she was sharing some conspiracy theory about me and her car troubles. Sure enough, later that day I received an email from our neighborhood association, which was voluntary and had no enforcement power, expressing concerns raised by several residents about unusual incidents involving my driveway. The email was vague but clearly Patricia-inspired, suggesting a community discussion about property boundaries and good neighborly relations. I replied politely, expressing my own concerns about repeated trespassing on my property and unauthorized use of my driveway, along with copies of my towing service calls as documentation. I never received a response, but I did notice several neighbors giving me curious glances when I collected my mail or worked in my front yard in the days that followed. The final confrontation came a week later. I arrived home from grocery shopping to find Patricia's BMW once again in my driveway. This time, however, she was still sitting in the driver's seat, engine off, clearly waiting for me. I parked on the street and approached her car. She rolled down her window with an expression that managed to be both triumphant and accusatory. "I know exactly what you did," she announced without preamble. "The valve stems. Very clever, but my mechanic figured it out when I had the entire car inspected." I said nothing, simply raising an eyebrow in question. He found microscopic scratch marks consistent with some kind of tool being used to partially depress the valve stems, she continued. "Not enough to cause immediate deflation, but enough to create a slow leak. Exactly what happened twice in your driveway." "That's an interesting theory," I replied carefully. "Though I'm not sure how it explains why you're once again parked in my private driveway without permission." "I'm making a point," Patricia said, her smile tight. "I've had cameras installed in my car, very discreet ones that record 360-degree footage whenever anyone approaches. If anything happens to my tires while I'm parked here today, I'll have video evidence of exactly how you do it." I considered this information. If she was telling the truth about the cameras, my garden hose approach would indeed be recorded if deployed. It was time for a different tactic. "Patricia," I said, shifting to a more conversational tone, "may I ask you something? Why my driveway? There's street parking available most days, and you have your own driveway. What is it about specifically parking in my space that's so important to you?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. "It's convenient," she said after a brief hesitation, "when I visit Marie or attend gatherings in the neighborhood. Convenient enough to risk repeated confrontations, towing fees, car troubles, and now a police report and neighborhood tension," I pressed. "That seems like a lot of inconvenience for the sake of convenience." Patricia's confident expression faltered slightly. "I don't appreciate being told where I can and can't park. And I don't appreciate having my property used without permission," I countered. "So we seem to be at an impasse. Except for one thing. The law is very clear that you can't park on private property without the owner's consent." She stared at me for a long moment, apparently reconsidering her position. Finally, she started her engine. "Fine. You win this round, Daniel, but don't think this is over between us." "Actually," I said, stepping back from her car, "I think it is over. Because I've also had cameras installed, overlooking my driveway. I have weeks of footage showing you repeatedly parking here without permission, which I've compiled and shared with my attorney. If your car appears in my driveway again, we'll be filing for a restraining order based on pattern of harassment." This was a bluff. I had some security footage but hadn't consulted an attorney. But Patricia's expression told me the bluff had worked. Her face paled slightly, and her grip tightened on the steering wheel. Without another word, she backed out of my driveway and drove to her own house, parking in her own driveway for perhaps the first time since she'd moved in. That evening, I reinstalled the dissuader components in my driveway, not because I expected to need them again, but because the system had worked exactly as designed, and I took professional pride in a successful project. I made some improvements to the concealment mechanisms and added a few extra features, just for the technical challenge. Patricia never parked in my driveway again. Our interactions became limited to cool nods when we happened to cross paths, which was perfectly fine with me. I heard through neighborhood gossip that she'd begun parking regularly at Marie's house instead, an arrangement that apparently was consensual, as Marie seemed to enjoy Patricia's social connections. About 6 months after our final confrontation, Patricia put her house on the market and moved away, allegedly for a job opportunity in another state. The new owners, a young couple with a toddler and another baby on the way, were friendly and respectful, always parking in their own driveway or on the street in front of their house. I kept the dissuader installed, but inactive, a hidden reminder of the lengths to which I'd gone to protect my property rights. Occasionally, when pulling into my driveway after a long day at work, I would glance at the innocent-looking concrete where my creation lay dormant and smile at the memory of Patricia's face when confronted with mysteriously deflating tires. The moral of this story isn't that you should build remote-controlled devices to torment difficult neighbors, but there is something to be said for using your own unique skills and knowledge when conventional methods fail. Patricia understood the language of inconvenience, so that's the language I chose to communicate in. And eventually, the message got through. If you're watching this video because someone keeps parking in your space, I'm not suggesting you follow my exact approach, but I am suggesting that sometimes the solution to a persistent problem requires creative thinking, careful execution, and just the right amount of plausible deniability. And maybe, just maybe, a background in electrical engineering doesn't hurt either.